When we talked last time, you mentioned that this was going to be going back to writing a true quartet. I just wondered if you could talk about a little bit more about how you viewed this quartet.
Well, something was a challenge and some was a bit of a problem because for one reason or another I was loaded with writing 4-string quartets, some of them large, some of them small, within the space of 3.5 years. And that 5th quartet was the one I did first. And then I knew that I'd got to write these 4 little pieces on the Dum Francis et Subatum plain chant based on the Christopher Tye pieces for viol consort. And that was fine. I was very interested in doing this, and I did them quite quickly. Then the Ardittis came to me and said, well, we need, for Elliott Carter's 100th birthday, we need a little piece to put in a concert. So, well, yes, right. So I wrote a little piece. It was supposed to be rather literal-mindedly 100 little sections. Luckily, it ended up as only 43, and much improved because of that, I think. But it was interesting to write a piece which was absolutely full of non sequiturs, that none of the sections followed from any of the other of the sections, other than that they were in some way contrasted, or there was some sort of dramatic causality involved of a fairly basic sort. And so that was quite a lot of work over three years, but the 2 little pieces somehow didn't seem to me to be quartet material, and I distinguished very carefully between string quartets and other pieces for 2 violins, viola and cello, as I think one needs to, historically speaking. And I tended to anyway. And so the Donaueschingen Festival then, because it was doing a very important focus on string quartets in this particular year, asked the Ardittis to suggest some composers who would then perhaps they would like to commission new quartets from. And of course I wouldn't turn that down, but the issue was that I'd just finished a very large ensemble piece called Kronos Ion, which was performed at Donaueschingen 2 years ago. And I perhaps was not in the best of tempers, shall we say, the best of states of mind to start a new, very large quartet project. And I knew when I did do a 6th quartet that it would be a long one. And all the pieces I've done, other than these 2 little pieces I've mentioned, have been quite large. The orchestral piece, Plötzlichkeit, 4 years ago was 23 minutes. Kronos Ion was 29 minutes. So I knew it would be in the environs of 20 to 30 minutes, let's say. And I felt the urge somehow to balance out the sonatas for string quartet that I'd written so many years ago in 20-odd little sections, with something also in tiny little sections, but these sections would not be placed next to each other contiguously, but they would be superimposed. Speaking specifically about this quartet, I think one of the challenges was how do you deal with the time implicit in the little fragments themselves? In other words, the sort of relationship to human gesturality, to human temporal sensibility, to somatic tensions, to heartbeat and breathing and so on. And at the same time write a piece which is made up of rather a large number of these small sections, which has to sustain itself and its musical architecture over quite a considerable time. And that was really what, at the beginning, caused me some heartburn, because I knew that following on from the orchestral piece and Kronos Ion, I'd been working with what you might call a sausage slicer technique, where the length of sections would be predetermined. The rhythmic structure, the instrumentation, and general dramatic flow of each of these sections would be determined, but that the other elements which go to make up the musical discourse would not then in advance be determined to the same degree. So I was working very much on a sort of section-to-section basis. And these sections were very small. And so the forms of the pieces consisted of more than 100 in each case, tiny sections in which the material either did or did not correspond in some sort of obvious way to the necessities imposed by the duration. And this quartet was meant to be the third in that cycle, which would take note of the experiences I'd made in this section-by-section mode of composing and making materials relate to the time-space in which they found themselves, but at the same time that these things would be superimposed. And in writing the piece, it became very clear to me that you overstep a boundary at a certain point where you have to decide, is it the large-scale architecture or is it the local, what you might call the motions, the interactions of the dramatis personae at any given moment, which fuel the motion of the piece. And so, much as I had been working in a sort of dialectical fashion with these two earlier pieces, I found there was one step more of the involuted dialectic involved in writing this piece, which was that the local technique of composing was very much based upon the motion of the individual figures. At the same time, the large-scale motion of the music was determined by certain factors involving each of the instruments in having a different sort of material which was very clearly its own, which we'll come to in a moment perhaps. And also that there were sections whose trajectory was very clear. For instance, the opening of the piece starts with the solo for cello. And this goes from the very lowest scordatura B flat of the cello all the way up to 3.5, 4 octaves higher. And the denouement, as it were, is where the second section then enters after the cello has reached its highest range in that particular segment. Now, the individual gestures from measure to measure and from subsection to subsection are very much sort of organicist, energetic, based upon standard models of how one would expound and prolong certain sorts of actions. At the same time, I knew that they had to hang together in producing this large-scale thrust from lowest register to highest register of the instrument. And so you're missing a middle ground here. What you get is the sort of authentication of the lowest level, which is the local level. Is it pizzicato? Is it sforzato? Is there a sort of upbeat function towards the beginning of the next measure? Does the size of the measure have a very major role to play in the degree to which the material internally differentiates itself or dissolves even under certain circumstances? How explicit is one, in other words, with respect to the sort of metric patterns which have been set up in advance? Unfortunately, as time goes on, of course, these things start overlapping each other. And the viola comes in next as a very rapid sort of triplet action, which mixes normal notes with half harmonics and full harmonics to produce sort of flurry of sound in various directions. And these things take on a life of their own with respect to how much space they want to fill. When you've only got one running at the same time, at any given time, you know that it is going to stop here. You've got 13 beats and this is what you do. But when you've got one that's 13 beats long, the other one begins at beat 7.5 and goes on 14 beats. What takes precedence under those circumstances? You have to make subsidiary decisions. And so it seemed to me if there were a dialectic or an inner contradiction which were built into this particular piece, it would be the sort of learning process involved as with respect to how I could accept the sort of void that opens up between the local gestural disposition of energies and the large-scale structure which I'd imposed upon myself. And there really is a sort of gap between these two things, and that had to be either filled or exposed, depending where one was in the piece. And in fact, halfway through the piece, it does break. A material imposed itself upon me, which is really quite simple, just simple repeated harmonics, which pass from instrument to instrument at different speeds. And it seems rather simple, primitive, a very basic idea altogether, but it emerged completely unexpectedly in response to the sort of, what shall we say, the contorted winding together of the various skeins of activity which until that point had been developed. I'd become familiar with them as things, but it was very difficult for me to bring them together or to make large-scale decisions on the basis of that particular experience. So one hears halfway through that the second violin takes up this material, the other instruments join, and this brings in really a focus which is not that of the basic material, the gestural material, but that of the harmonic domain. That in this piece, in fact, unlike other pieces of mine, I'm working, I won't say with the tonal structure, but I'm working with referential pitches. I'm working with B flat, D, and F sharp, which of course makes an augmented triad. It's symmetrical. And I work with distorted dominants. That is, of course, there's the perfect fifth dominant on the B flat. There is a microtonally enlarged dominant on the F sharp, goes to C3 quarter sharp. And it goes the other way, to C quarter sharp. Then there is the D, which goes up to A quarter sharp. And so one has a nice set of mutually corresponding sort of relationships which are very comfortable with each other and one can use. So from that point on in the work, I was attempting to create sort of tonal analogues, not using tonal triads, not using consonance-dissonance relationships, but trying to propose middle term or middle ground fields of consistency in which one or two of those notes plus their dominants would be in the foreground of the generation of pitch materials, which would then, of course, play into the mutual impingement of the other materials. So this was something that was unexpected, and it did enable me to finish the piece, and I did produce a piece of 25 minutes. But as I said, it was something that revealed itself to me really rather spontaneously in the course of the work on the piece. Whilst I had an overall form for it, and I knew how long these individual things were meant to be, of course, the local working on detail really threw all these plans out of the window. And I was happily forced to deal with the sort of expressive reality of the local transformations of the individual instruments' materials, whilst at the same time feeding them through a sort of rather primitive and consistent pseudo-tonal matrix of pitch consistency, rather intervallic consistency, I suppose.
You mentioned beforehand about the sort of local gestures themselves, but there also seems to be a feeling of not just the cello solo, but each of the instruments seem to have their own type of direction as a series of gestural materials which are a bit more consistent than that. There's a cello solo, there's a second violin solo, there's a very explicit first violin solo.
Well, that's right, and the second violin has an extremely irregular and rather acerbic solo. It's always getting very irritated with the other instruments. Well, at the beginning of the piece, what one hears immediately is the fact that the cello is in the foreground, and that whatever the cello is playing, it's getting higher and higher. So that's why I call it a solo, for the sake of argument. At the same time, the two violins are playing material which occurs on many occasions throughout the piece, either as a sort of background filler and means of creating a sort of pseudo-perspective in the superimposition of materials, or in any case, it's something which is rather based upon the wood of the bow. So it's rather transparent, it's sandy, shall we say. It's like sandpaper. It just has, it's very dry. And it's not meant at all to come into the foreground, no matter what sort of gestural elements it might otherwise seem to contain. At the same time, the viola is starting entirely pizzicato and is commenting upon the structure of the individual measures in their sort of ratio relationships to each other, and is building up a sort of what one might call a repertoire of ways in which measures can be anticipated or reflected upon a posteriori. So these three different things are occurring at the same time. So it's already quite dense. But at the same time, the collegno material, if one likes, the background sort of material, is something that is non-directional. It can be made to conform to the gestural pulses, to the wave formations, the tendencies of the other material at any point. As the piece goes on, however, we do find more of an opposition being set up between the harmonic, regular pulsing materials, of which I spoke earlier, and the insistence of these sort of woody sounds to come into their own. And so there are sections in which I deliberately take them as central focus. Usually in those sections, the measures are rather short, so that one can sort of parse the material into little pulses, bursts, resonances which remain after the main attack has disappeared, and so on. So they do have a sort of set of tactics via which I make them viable on their own. But nevertheless, it is something that's extremely useful as the piece goes on, and towards the end of the piece, these materials do in fact occur again and take on a much more important role than they did at the beginning. So always there's a transformation between what you might call the woody sounds and the normal sounds of the strings and the harmonic sounds of the pulsing, regardless of the actual local gestural identity that's being proposed by one or other of the instruments at any given moment.
The second violin solo seems much more like to be in the background, as if it's sort of trying to break through, and in a sense never does quite break through the surface. Whereas the first violin solo definitely comes to the fore. It starts as an accompanied solo before it becomes explicitly.
Yes, well, the first violin solo develops over a certain amount of time. It starts as just as simply as a faster version of what the other instruments are doing. And the other instruments then are gradually eaten away by the insistence of the violin, and in fact the main body of the first violin material is really literally solo, playing by himself, albeit in two parts. And so that's the most obvious way in which one can move from the interiority of material towards bringing it out into the foreground. You simply use it to eat away other things that are going on at the same time. And these are fairly automatic procedures which one can apply, or they may be innate to the material itself, and I think one does hear the difference.
There's also the situation where the first violin, it's literally a prolation. It's going 2.5 times faster than the other instruments. That's unusual in your music, or at least it's to my point of view, if having something which is so literally a prolation.
No, not really. If you look back to La Chute du Quart with clarinet and ensemble, that's how the piece begins. The whole point of La Chute du Quart being a true reflection upon postmodern insufficiencies begins where a normal piece would end, that is, with the literal statement of the thematic material in rising and falling extremely banal form. And the instruments of the ensemble are simply resonating the notes of the solo clarinet in various speeds and in various ways in different octaves. So no, I've done this sort of thing before. It's not something with which I would normally start a piece. So I think at that point it was quite a revolutionary thing for me to do something quite that explicit. But in this particular piece, it seemed, as the piece went on, I could afford to undertake more and more of these sort of wayward local game-playing strategies without necessarily deleteriously impacting the overall flow where the piece is supposed to be going. So, yeah, the more one works on a piece, the more freedom you have to try things. Yes, I suppose you'd say try them out and see what happens. And so that also makes for a somewhat seemingly episodic form, because of course one then focuses on one particular aspect of one particular type of material and remains with that for a certain amount of time before moving on to the next multiple section.
Because I hear it much more like individual instruments which have got characterizations, like we were describing about solos, within the context of the other instruments, of which they change their focus, they change their relationship one to another. The viola seems to have a different sort of relationship, as if it's trying to make a frame for the other instruments to relate around, both a metric one but also a harmonic one.
Well, each of these materials has a particular sort of more or less obvious way of expanding itself to metastasize through the texture and frustrate what the other materials ought to be doing in that particular time. The viola material is a case in point. I mentioned earlier these sort of very rapid triplet motions. And these are taken up on many occasions as both as a means of providing a background structure, but also of occluding, I suppose would be the word, the seemingly or supposedly more important actions going on in one or other of the other instruments. So, yes, you find that the different materials, and this is something that interests me very much, the different materials are not only contrasted in themselves, but each of them offers different opportunities for tripping up, as it were, the other sorts of action which were theoretically planned for that particular moment. So there's a great deal of one-upmanship in terms of how these materials are motivated to expand and differentiate themselves in the course of the piece.
You mentioned on your, earlier about the harmonic language, especially about the augmented triad and the false dominant triad. There also seems to be a particular use of microtonal inflections, which are they tempered eighth tones?
The use of eighth tones in this piece is very much as a sort of central tone modifier. In other words, insofar as I have prolongational chord sequences or changing pitch sequences, which give rise to different types of chordal situations, inside the rather static nature of the hierarchy of the three main tones, we do find that, of course, quarter tones will lead to and away from in terms of leading notes and sort of Neapolitans. And on another level, one can progress further, and insofar as the material evinces any particular tendency, desire harmonically to move in a particular direction, I can modify that or indeed negate it inside the motion of eighth tone steps. So by choosing 3 or 4 contiguous eighth tone intervals, I can arrive at a place which, whilst it doesn't do violence to the harmonic flow on the top level, it nevertheless modifies it quite extremely in the interstices of how the energies are disposed and how one interprets them.
So you've seen the eighth tones as principally a linear mechanism, as a sort of neighbourhoods for passing notes?
It's linear in the same sense that passing notes are linear in tonal music. They are not central, they are not required, but they can come quite seriously to modify the how we interpret what's going on.
But there are certainly other points in the piece that are actually harmonic constructions, which are very sort of like referential harmonies, which you were coming back to.
Well, there are procedures which I use, which, when applied to different situations, may indeed come up with these sort of similarities. I didn't set out with a series of harmonic devices which could be applied in different circumstances. I think each of them was generated ad hoc to fit a particular situation. However, I did know at the end of the piece that I wanted to detune the G string of the viola to F sharp, so that we had open strings on B flat, D, and F sharp. So the final section of the piece is very much concerned with sort of the coming to terms of these 3 main notes with their relative constellations of secondarily available motions. And right at the end, as usual in my music, very often we find a sort of ironic gesture or ineffable ironic gesture, or the searching for the sublime of the relationship between these 3 symmetrical pitches in pitch space, in which the hyperchromatic motion, the eighth tone motion, and the quarter tone motion both seem to be yearning to bring these 3 notes into prominence, but in fact the piece ends by the eighth tone and quarter tone motions themselves leading us astray and into completely sort of non-functional territory.
You also mentioned in rehearsal about certain of these gestures resembling other types of music. The reference, not really reference, allusion to the fourth movement of Schoenberg's Second Quartet. Were these actually sort of discoveries of yours, or were they? Yes, no. When I wrote it, I knew, that this had to come here at this particular moment, because that was the way I needed things to go. But it was not, I was not unaware of that particular relationship. It's not one which I would put any weight on. Other than the fact that I did myself write a quartet with soprano, of course. No, I'm not a composer on the whole who... I'm neither a composer of musica docta, nor am I a composer of hints and whispers and winks with respect to one's sources. So Burglaric Suite and Debussy Quartet are not references? No, not at all. You mentioned about the temporal layering and the way that you were thinking about that for the whole quartet. How were you thinking about those pulses and your experience of musical time? Well, I was trying to use units which were of approximately similar length to the 2 large pieces that I'd written immediately previously, but I wanted to investigate various ways of impingement which actually made them overlap. And so the problem was that once one gets to a stage where 3 or 4 of these things are to some extent overlapping, you have to make very serious decisions with regard to how any one of those levels is going to be represented. Is it going to be represented only by one instrument, or will all 4 layers be represented by all 4 instruments indifferently, for instance? So already you're getting into a certain sort of dark zone of obscurity with respect to the appurtenance of types of figurality to overarching durations. And so it seemed to me one of the very early learning experiences I went through with this piece was that I was going to have to rely less upon these
these durations, which in the other pieces gave rise to sort of chains of fragments. But in this particular case, I couldn't rely upon the concept of fragmentation to bring instruments together to meaningfully represent any one or other particular duration. So I simplified somewhat on that level, and I complexified perhaps in the way in which I then allowed myself to treat the materials locally, which meant that there is a sort of middle ground motion in the piece, but it's much more difficult to hear than many of my pieces, I think, because there is a great deal of punning going on. And it's very hard at prima vista to understand what's in the foreground and what's not in the foreground, because you may not, at any given moment, recognize or register the stage of evolution of a particular sort of material until it reveals itself at some later stage. One's always sort of playing a game of blind man's buff with respect to credibility of the future of a particular type of action or statement.
But towards the end of the piece, the pulses are actually explicit, and you hear them as these pulsed harmonics. Mm-hmm. But the tempo of those pulses towards the end seem to be related to the tempo that you use for the gestures earlier on in the piece.
One of the issues, of course, with the treatment of time in contemporary music is how realistic are the distinctions between the subcategories of temporal experience, which in fact are available to us. What is tempo? What is density? What is metric structure? How are these things interrelated? How do I make the sudden change between long measures to short measures audible? How does it make itself meaningful? How does it intercede, as it were, between time and material? So I decided in this particular piece that I was going to work only with a number of tempo relationships. In many pieces in recent years, I've tried to simplify the concept of tempo by relying upon what you might call tempo trees. That is, on the one hand, tempi which arithmetically are related. You might say 60, 64, 68, 72, a very simple example, in which the digital difference between each of them is identical, but because the ratio relationship is constantly changing, the actual relationship is somewhat more complex. But that's one way of doing it. The other way I choose of doing it is to set up ratio relationships right from the beginning, let's say 3:2 or 5:4, in which case you'd say, all right, if tempo equals 60, what would 5/4 of that be? In terms of, you divide it into 4, multiply by 5, and you have a new tempo. And if you consistently apply this, you arrive at a much more sort of logarithmic sweep of distinctions than you do in the somewhat more primitive procedurally, but somewhat more subtle in terms of psychoacoustic reality of the other tree. And if you put these two trees together, you find very often there are very close or identical correspondences between the two, which allow you to change trains. You can jump from what train going in one direction to train going in the other direction really rather easily. And that does make a big difference in terms of how performers can relate to the actual material at different speeds. Of course, I use metric modulation occasionally, but I think it occurs in like 5 or 6 places in the piece. What I do towards the end is I make much more explicit the irrational values of some of the pulse structures, in that you might have triplet pulses going on, and then there'll be a measure of 5/24, which will be also in triplet pulses of identical duration, but everything else is moving suddenly around it, and that goes back into normal beats afterwards. And there are several places in the final section of the piece where I do this. But in general, I regard things like that not as changes of tempo, any more than 5/16 is different to 3/8. They're both in the same tempo. They're both based upon multiples or divisions of the same beat structure. And so I regard them as less central to my formal or dramatic conception than would be a tempo change, for instance. But when I do tempo changes, it's always within a very strictly managed range of possible variational factors. I'm very frequently asked about why I prefer to write string quartets to many other genres. And apart from the fact that I like doing it, there are other considerations at play, I think, which impinge upon the relationship of contemporary music to society in one way or another. There is a big difference between a string quartet and a string trio, for instance. String trio is a much more static type of chain form relating to the Baroque trio sonata. The string quartet, right from the beginning, was always a somewhat more labile, but also therefore much more subtle medium for the expression of social relationships. We know the old image of, four civilized people talking to each other in terms that would not have been unfamiliar to philosophers of the Enlightenment. And whilst that, of course, is somewhat absurd from the present-day standpoint, and indeed was turned on its head by Charles Ives, who had four very irascible characters climbing a mountain and shrieking at each other for 15 minutes. It does seem to me there is something about the quartet which is inherently imbricated with what we understand human relationships to be on a highly evolved level. One of the things that people always suggest these days about the string quartet is that it's a sort of elitist medium. But the argument I would bring is this, that the sort of contemporary music that explicitly carries its politics on its sleeve is in fact selling out to all sorts of domains and pressures which it is not really in a sufficiently sophisticated state to deal with. Whereas if one thinks of a string quartet as essentially being the epitome of what you might call, I won't call absolute music, I think that term itself has been very often misunderstood, but sort of autochthonous linguistic generation. It's this aspect of it, this very self-sufficiency of it, which I think makes it much more open to receiving impressions from the world, in a serious sense, from the world around it and treating them in some sort of useful fashion. Autonomy is extremely important in the contemporary arts. I know it's not very fashionable to say that, but it seems to me that simply referring to things and making sort of snide artistic comments in one medium or another is a very cheap way of relating to the world in general. I think we as artists have got to accept that there are certain paths which lead to useful autonomy in a work of art or a linguistic medium, which are not amenable to being realized with that sort of simple-minded, iconic relationship to external reality. And I think that's perhaps why I keep writing quartets, that music isn't a language, but we can treat it like a language, and we can create linguistified forms of sonic environment which succeed to the extent, A, that they can stand on their own terms, and B, that they can become porous to the sort of experiences which we as listeners bring to it. And so that's my hope, that writing string quartets for me personally has extended my idea of what linguistic expression might be. It's extended my idea of what is relevant or not relevant in musical expression. And I guess I'm pretty bald-faced about it, that I think we should not abandon such tattered remnants of the concept of autonomy and autochthony, which have been left to us in order to sell out to media which are very happy if we do so, because they're so much more powerful than we are. The other aspect of contemporary musical hope which is available to us is the dedicated group of performers. These are usually of fairly modest dimensions. A quartet is very typical of that. And of course, as one sees when one spends a lot of time working with these people, solving particular, as it were, fifth wheel problems of the composer, do bring forth certain mechanisms, automated mechanisms, in the performing group, which are extremely exciting. And even when one knows people very well, sometimes one's surprised by the one reaction or the other which a group brings forth. We should never forget that contemporary music wouldn't exist these days, I think, without dedicated ensembles. There are many, many ensembles in the world, as was demonstrated in Darmstadt this year, when many young ensembles were invited from places like the Ukraine, for instance, to bring their repertoire with them. If groups like that didn't exist, we would be in very parlous straits. It may well be that the large orchestra, standard concert venue will no longer be available to us after a certain amount of time, in which case we depend as composers on our organic liaison with these performing groups, not just quartets, in order to maintain a certain sort of professional human interface, shall we say. We can't just sit at home on our chairs. That would really be the picture, the true picture of the ivory tower composer, just sitting there and then putting it in the post, and then a CD comes back 6 weeks later of your piece. And of course, it shouldn't be like that at all. We as composers and performers, as generators of media material, really need to work together all the time. And there's nothing I enjoy more than sort of mixing it in a rehearsal, if I get the chance.
You have written now 5 major quartets, the second to the sixth, for the Arditti Quartet. How has that process evolved in terms of your compositional evolution, but also the evolution of the quartet itself?
Well, actually, that's not quite accurate. The second quartet was written before I knew Irvine Arditti, and they had just made a big splash for themselves in London at that time, must have been 1980, I suppose, playing the Ligeti pieces, which were thought to be sort of vaguely unperformable by anybody else. And I was recommended to Irvine, and we met in a pub of all strange things, and he was extremely sceptical. He said, "It doesn't need to be this difficult. Why are you doing this sort of thing? Why put quarter tones in here and so on? You can't play those quarter tones." And I suppose I ultimately wore him down, that I knew what I was doing, and there were some things which he would have done differently, which I had thought of in a particular fashion, certain sorts of technique, or the certain ways that strings would be utilized without so much need for motion of the bow, so you could just go from one string to another and it still produce a figuration. But from that point on, it was very clear that once they'd play those things, then I entered what I like to think of as a friend's relationship with the quartet, and as well as a professional one. And then it was very clear that I thought of them, first of all, as the prime purveyors and realizers of my vision. That seemed to me at the time perfectly normal. All the performers in my early years as a composer, when I was finally being performed, were people who were extremely idealistic, extremely intelligent, and for the most part quite young, same age as me or younger. And so that seemed to me an essential ingredient in the quartet situation, that I could write things which would immediately be latched upon, and one wouldn't need to go through that sort of psychological baby carriage pushing sort of stage in dealing with performers. And clearly it was of major importance to me. It was part of the way in which my life developed. It created a self-tradition, as it were, of quartet writing. And I have been quite fascinated how, over the years, the quartet has transformed itself. It's something at the moment absolutely evolved and quite remarkable. The body of performers who are there now is something which is unique, I think. It's very interesting for me because I first got to know Lucas Fels, the cellist, when I was teaching at the Freiburg Musikhochschule, city we're in now, and He had never played a piece of contemporary music in his life. He came there as a sort of somewhat shy, I suppose, 19, 20-year-old, and was faced with an absolutely rabiate piece by one of the students in the composition course. And he didn't know where to start, and the composer was trying to help him and couldn't. And I came in, and because, well, I was used to working in that way, I could put him on the right path. And we've been very good friends since then. That was 30-odd years ago. So it's good to see how individuals and groups mutually evolve, and how learning and creating situations can have a sort of life history of their own.
And do you feel that the type of way that they perform also affects your music?
It's a very interesting question. In the early days, I suppose, when I was writing my third quartet, certainly, and then perhaps the fourth, the formation of the quartet was rather stable, and sometimes the second violin changed, but the rest of the group was very stable. And it was very difficult sometimes to write a note on an instrument without seeing that particular person trying to play that note. And that had a good and a bad side. Of course, there could be a lot of self-parody involved in that. One could write that sort of piece, and I didn't want to do that. I was very automatically very chary of typecasting myself in that particular role. And so it's been of great interest to me to see, as the quartet has changed and renewed itself, that to a certain extent it's allowed me to move into different areas that wouldn't necessarily have occurred to me at an earlier stage. So I'm very optimistic that even working primarily with the Arditti Quartet, one isn't tied down by a oversimplified and limited view of what the characters of the individual instrumentalists, in fact, are like.